Yo, Jerry, this is all about you, and it's the absolute truth. Well, my truth, as I see you. So just stop shushing me or rolling your eyeballs and let me do my thing. This is my tribute to you. You know, we don't ever live our lives to intentionally be movers and shakers or think that we will change the world. But Jerry acquired all the necessary skills to do just that. He was an activist, an advocate for the underserved communities, a dentist, a politician, a poet, a musician, and an artist, a passionate visionary who could tell stories until the cows came home. He was politically savvy and a loud promoter of the arts, particularly with a finite focus on Japanese Americans and Asian Americans. He was a refined and astute dentist. My brother was a voice, and yes, he changed the world. Wow, what an explosive nutshell for a guy who tended to love downtime, solitude, being alone, and one who put a huge priority on privacy. When you delve into Jerry's memorial website, you'll hear a view, read tributes and statements about the difference he made in the world, the nonprofit boards and arts commissions he served on, and the difference he made on people who lived and associated with him, the difference he made on you, the difference he made on me. You'll cry with all of us because of our deep and profound love for him, my brother who surrounds us forever by the contributions he made during his life. He will blow you away. It will have that wow kind of effect at the expanse and impact he made in people's lives. Not just friends and colleagues, but in particular, young and budding artists of color. So why this focus on art? Why this vision and passion? Why this drive to activism? To understand my brother, we look to his past. Becoming Jerry. Jerry was born on September 8th, 1947, but there's so much more to it than a momentous day when my parents welcomed a much-cherished boy as their firstborn. He was a post-World War II baby boomer. World-transforming events occurred prior to his birth that would later influence his desire to first find his Japanese-American identity and roots, and later want to preserve our Japanese-American heritage right here where we lived, right here in San Jose. My parents, as well as my grandparents' lives were drastically changed during World War II. Being of Japanese ancestry, my mom and my dad's families were uprooted from their homes in San Pedro and Sebastopol, California. My mom, an American citizen, was illegally incarcerated in the horse stalls at the infamous Santa Anita racetrack for a year, and later shipped to Jerome, Arkansas internment camp. And my father luckily escaped internment by the benevolence of the dean at Washington University in St. Louis, who helped him get off the West Coast to continue his dental school training by offering him a place at his school. That dean and a lot of others like him believed what was happening to Japanese American citizens on the West Coast was unconstitutional and totally wrong. By war's end, the Taki family and the Hiura family were relocated to Chicago from camp. My dad was still finishing dental school and shortly after graduation passed the state boards and began teaching Crown and Bridge at Washington University. And both he and my mom fell in love, where they met in Chicago and married in 1946. It was in this particular cultural milieu where racism surrounded the JA enclave in Chicago that my brother was born. The war, internment, and virulent racism would shape my brother's life in a pronounced and dramatic way, marked by silence, especially from my parents and their generation. We grew up without knowing why we're seen as different. Who am I? What am I? A visionary. One of my very first recollections was sharing a room with my brother. I was about 2 and he was 4. We were living in Chicago. I thought I'd love sharing this space with him. However, one night in the wee hours of the morning, he was yelling and screaming, Terror filled the room. He woke me up. Mom rushed in. "Whatever is the matter?" she asked. Sitting up bone straight, fright filled his eyes. He cried out, "I see feet coming out of the wall. I see feet coming out of the wall." A nightmare, one of many. But right then and there, Jerry the visionary was born. I never had nightmares. But all I can say is I was just happy when I finally got my own room. My brother was 2.5 years older than I, and I grew up just idolizing and adoring him. I admired him. I hung on his every word. I followed him around everywhere, which he hated. Even then, he wanted to be alone. Or maybe he just wanted to get away from me. Nah. But I also served as his guinea pig. I was a perfect shield for his tall tales because I am, to this day, totally gullible and was a wonderful sounding board as he grew up. He learned to tell stories, fibs, and huge lies even to see my reaction. He learned to read me like a book and knew exactly what buttons to push to have me get off on him. He made me cry one time when he told me when I was about 5, "There is no Santa Claus, Barbara." And when I didn't believe him, he showed me where Mom and Dad stashed the Christmas presents. I was devastated. My brother was born with a very myopic left eye, meaning nearsighted. That eye would be sight challenged his whole life, but perhaps also gave him a unique insight into the world, especially the world he saw and painted. Racism. He was about 7 when the family was allowed back to California in 1954, and returning home for my parents was important. In spite of restricted covenants and a white neighborhood who didn't want us, we moved in anyway. Not Japantown, and we went to almost primarily white schools. Our parents wanted to raise us as Americans, white Americans. Jerry matriculated easily, made friends, and shined in the classroom where he fit the JA model minority stereotype. Studious, hardworking, but not so quiet. His strengths appeared early. In one progress report from 5th grade, it stated, "Poor in sports, very artistic, a capable student." Well, there you go. Lifelong statements of truisms. Check out this early drawing Mom kept, one he did when he was about 6. She was so proud. Pretty good, huh? He was doing whales, octopi, and deep sea divers, while when I reached his age, I could only manage painted handprints on paper. In and around school, we were called names, racial epithets, and we both suffered these insults in silence and hunkered down. Jerry did his very best to bury that hurt, that our difference in the white world was not tolerated, and put on a social face outward, a face he would have his entire life. He worked hard to fit in. Before he was out of junior high school, he had already painted a Van Gogh-esque Starry Nights kind of scene with oils so thick it never, ever, ever dried. Also during that time, he sculpted a 3-masted schooner that had massive amounts of rigging and gun ports using modeling clay and chopsticks. I think he was gifted back then, because at that time he also created a working catapult using clay and toothpicks, from which he fired clay balls, battering my one enormous giant clay soldier. No, he didn't do vases or bowls. He made armies of bullet-shaped men, like minions, gracing his entire board. The Confederate versus Yankee armies sporting rifles, hats, guns, no arms, no legs, no heads, no faces, but hundreds of them. Who does that? He had a unique vision. But then I was his starry-eyed sister, admiring all of his creative works. He couldn't do anything wrong. I think he liked the tactile feel of clay and thus made for his wonderful hands for dentistry and painting. While doing very well in high school, achieving advanced placement in all the core subjects, math, calculus, trig, science, history, and English, he was well-rounded, but enjoyed his art classes above all. He was in student body government, honor society, and even tried sports, swimming and track. But perhaps the weakest area in his resume, as he was foretold in his 5th grade report. Like I said, he fitted himself to a white world and a stereotype of being Japanese American. He scored well in his SATs and was welcomed to UC Berkeley in 1965. He went along doing all those normal boy things, some good, some bad, and further developing his social skills. He joined Sigma Alpha Mu, a Jewish fraternity where he fit in well. White, but not so white. He became a master storyteller, highlighting some of his talents, some true, some not so true, but he began realizing he could read people quickly, easily make friends, meet girls with his gift of gab, and still remain pretty much unrevealing of his innermost feelings and private thoughts. This duality was a skill he relied on and relished his whole life. Jerry, the artist and passionate humanitarian. As with most of us, he came of age in college and was exposed to SDS. Now, that's not a disease. It's the Students for a Democratic Society, the Third World Movement, Angela Davis, socialism and communism, and the counterculture. His world opened up to the needs of the people, of poverty, of racism, and being a person of color, trying to figure out all this time who he was in the white world, having been denied his own history. He became engrossed with the counterculture, taking dead aim at our pseudo-white lifestyle and Dad's Republican ideology of pulling oneself up by their bootstraps and making it in this world. He was becoming politically conscious. He argued at home and fed chickens to impoverished Asians living in San Francisco. A voracious reader, his mind expanded with philosophers like Proust and Camus. In his downtime, he painted and began playing the guitar and sang protest songs. He became aware of our own history, denied and silenced up until then. He learned about World War II, DOJ, and internment camps, subjects my parents never talked about. He and I began searching for identity to remove the psychosis of not being white. With such a low draft number, too, as the Vietnam War raged in the late 60s, we believed a white war against a third world country, he made decisions that impacted his direction and stayed the course towards dentistry rather than the arts he loved to retain his student deferment. He often told me he would have fled to Canada rather than take up arms against other Asians. He was a pacifist. I think he was also afraid. In his 5th year at Berkeley, earning a degree in optometry as he bided his time trying to get into dental school, he sold his motorcycle and took the money to travel to France. He slept on park benches, rode the trains, met fascinating people, and was exposed to French society, their culture, and yes, the Impressionists. He was enamored with the Musée d'Orsay. Sold. He fell in love with Paris, lock, stock, and barrel, and all it had to offer in art, jazz, and international culture. He breathed that rarefied air, and that fired him up. Now passionate, his artistic vision is exploding. In dental school at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, it was my dad's alma mater. It was a beautiful high-end campus situated right in the middle of an economically depressed part of St. Louis. Once a place where police guarded our newly purchased home so we could safely move in as we were in danger from the white community around us. Now a place where my brother could go to school, and there in the economically depressed area have access to clients for up-and-coming dental and medical students. Kind of ironic. There he continued all his passions, painting, music, and now free verse, a type of poetry which is published out of the university's chapbooks. Oh my goodness, free verse, a form I never quite understood as words were slapped together in what I felt was a haphazard way, but indeed, perhaps a way into the artist's mind. He laughed at me when I thought his poetry were words coming from a tortured and depressed soul. I have come to adore his later work, which appeared in his art book called The Hawkswell. I know he did a brief stint at Harvard, breathing in that Ivy League experience and growing as a humanitarian, but I believe he was unsure of returning home and joining Dad in business. I believe he felt that pressure to measure up. You know how it is being a boy in a Japanese family. I think those early years working with Dad were the toughest he had to face in joining the world as a producer and getting grounded in his lifelong work. Jerry did not look professional at all. His hair was long and uncontrollable. He tied a shoelace around his head and wore jeans and tight shirts, vestiges of his college days. But he was talented and had a fine pair of hands. I loved his hands in my mouth. They were never heavy or hurt my jaws as others have. I also loved his numbing injections. My dad would inject and start drilling almost immediately. Ow, ow, stop, please. But Jerry would give you the lidocaine and leave you for about 45 minutes. Not only were my teeth dead to the world when he returned, but so was my tongue. Now working in San Jose's Japantown provided new stomping grounds to explore. There he was also exposed to the world of nonprofits and the dearth of literature and arts by Japanese and Chinese Americans. One of the first was a Japanese American curriculum project out of San Mateo and Asian Americans for Community Involvement. His early work with these nonprofits in the late 70s gave him the tools he needed to springboard forward. I think he knew more about activism and social concerns for the underserved populations in San Jose before he knew about being a businessman. He was now grounded in the world of nonprofits and social activism. He had a vision about promoting arts being generated by Japanese and Chinese Americans too, and later became political by joining and being appointed to arts boards and commissions. But then, the unimaginable happened. Dad passed away suddenly in 1987, and he was forced to immediately take over the family practice, while the whole family was still in shock. Talk about a quick learning curve, but it seemed to be a release from a certain kind of pressure. And Jerry grew. He blossomed and flourished. Using what Dad taught him about running a practice, he began moving to his own beat and rhythms, developing his singularly unique managing style. He was truly a humanist and a giving service provider to all who came to his practice. Finding and marrying his soulmate, Lucia Cha, in 2006, sealed the deal, and this dynamic duo was a mighty force to contend with. His practice grew, and he moved to a larger building, hiring more associate dentists, hygienists, and office assistants. They were a family, and his staff absolutely adored him. And what an office! He opened up the operatories, filled the rooms with Oaxacan art, paintings by young artists of color, a number of eye-catching mobiles, and Tom Kamofuji prints. And also, what a clientele to speak of, from all walks of life, in all parts of the city, budding artists to polished politicians and community leaders. With his hands in their mouths, they had to listen to him in that one-sided conversation. He got a lot of work he was passionate about done in his chair. My brother was a genuinely pretty good guy, humanitarian and personable, giving, humble, and he gave to the causes he held dear. And when he was in your presence, if you ever could really actually get him in your presence, he was 100% with you. He was able to make me see the world he lived in, his travels, his politics, and the stories that brought me inside. His stories made me laugh to tears, and I will cherish them forever. Thankfully, I grew up in the same cultural era as he, and we were always on the same page, even though we came together in different directions, especially with finding identity through the white history we were fed. I came from the context of Asian American and African American studies and the academia of ethnic studies. We talked social justice, we talked about cultural diversity, we talked about racism, empowerment, and talked about change through grassroots community advocacy. That is his legacy he now leaves. From the work of the Japanese Community Congress of San Jose, for which he was an integral part, Japantown can boast pride in a thriving ethnic community that has monuments, markers, and quiet resting places reminding us of our heritage. My brother's private collection. I have been fortunate enough to acquire my brother's artwork at various stages of his life. In 1969, he did self-portraits of himself and his girlfriend while attending Berkeley. I call it Jerry's self-portrait vis-a-vis Modigliani. Mom's comment, "That's not a man, that's a woman." He was so humble of his work, like, "Nah, it's just crap," and easily gave it to me when I asked him for it. I took the rolled up self-portrait home to Sacramento and immediately had it framed. This self-portrait has hung in every house that I have ever lived and now hangs in my mom's bedroom. I was honored, and I have to believe he was thrilled I liked it. In the early 80s, I paid him a visit while he was living in Palo Alto. His house reeked of smoke. Seeking Jerry out, I entered his studio. You could cut the smoke with a knife. When I could finally see him, cig hanging from his lips and painting away, he showed me several of his fairy fantasy kinds of work. I loved the color, the brightness, and all the action going on in there. And then I asked him, I said, "Can I have one?" He was again saying, "Really? You like this?" I guess he didn't think much of his work and easily gave me one. However, all of his art pieces weren't different. Sometimes he had many of the same one done over and over and over again. But I came away with my second prize to my limited but growing collection. His final piece we have came in 2017. For several years, Jerry, now 71, had been moving further away from his dental practice, removing himself and backing off from boards, commissions, and nonprofits. He was moving away from public life and going inward toward his soul, I believe. So he wanted to play the guitar more, he wanted to paint more, and he wanted to do some traveling. So this old man in the countryside was done in acrylics, his medium of choice now, and shows his continued love for the Impressionists. He gave this to Mom and I that Christmas. Mom said, "I love it!" and hung it for the world to see in our home. Jerry was like, "Really?" A smile growing within him. You know how having Mom's praise was the feather he craved. She was pretty stingy with her compliments. So if she liked it, that was really saying something. It was the approval he'd always been looking for. So in receiving Mom's praise, his inner soul was suddenly uplifted and warmed. That's a moment I'll never forget. I'll cherish his art and the private and humble attitude upon which it was given. You know, I have a ton of memories of my brother. And as a young person, he was everything to me. He was my rock and my anchor growing up. And when I got older, he was my shield and protector. He was smart, creative, and far more worldly than I. He put himself out there as a face person and doer, and could be quite social, but retained that private self, that private side. While he reveled in downtime, that inner part of him comes through, perhaps in his outspoken advocacy, as well as in his own art, his music, and I think in particular his poetry. His life was full. He told me just before he passed, "I did everything I wanted to do. I am fulfilled. I just wished I had more time to do the things that brought life to his soul, his guitar playing and painting more pictures. And he wanted more time to travel and be with Lucia. So what a lament for him." Yes, my brother truly was a mover and shaker in our community. He shook us up, expanding our capacity to know the arts of people of color and breaking down white cultural and historical barriers by being a political voice for change. My introverted loner brother was my idol. And whenever we were together, the light of my soul was fired up, as that is where he touched me with his stories, impressions, expressions, and presence. I feel fortunate to have had a sort of intimate relationship with him, to know some of his inner workings, some of his secrets, and just being his little sister. I so miss him. My light is so much duller now that he is gone. I really miss you, Jerry, and I'm really very heartbroken that you left. You know I will love you always and remember you forever.
Thy